I'm delighted to be here. One reason I'm delighted is that I went to Harvard College years ago, and so I wandered around this morning, despite the wind chill factor, which was really tough, and wandered around my old haunts and saw the scenes of many of my ups and downs in dating relationships. And I got to say, I wish I had had this course or this lecture, which is actually part of where it grew out of. And so I think you're going to be happy, or maybe you'll make fewer of the mistakes that I did. On a more academic note, when I was at Harvard, I was in Eliot House. And someone from Eliot House? Okay. So there were no women in Eliot House when I was there, which was too bad. But it would have been more fun. But anyway, as at least one of the people in the audience probably know, Charles Eliot was a famous president of Harvard. He was a chemist and a mathematician, and he had a big war with the faculty when he was here in the 1890s over the curriculum, because he felt that they overemphasized the classics, studying Latin and Greek, and that they ought to have some science in the curriculum. The good news was that Charles Eliot won that battle. Part of my battle is to help universities have marriage education and relationship education, a more practical sort, in the curriculum. And so what I'm going to be telling you about is excerpts from a course that I've been teaching for the last 10 years at Northwestern. It's a 4-credit course for undergraduates. One other note about Harvard that's, I think, kind of cute is when I was here, you can tell me if this is still true, but I don't think it is. When I was here, they had one requirement for graduation, which was kind of unusual, was you had to be able to swim 100 yards. I don't think they still have that. They have it at Columbia? They do? And it always made sense to me. We put all this money into this undergraduate education, you don't want people drowning, you know? And so far as I know, none of my classmates drowned. But many of them did get divorced, and including myself. I had a very unhappy experience the first time around, which is another reason why I'm here talking to you. But I think that I feel sort of the same way about marriage education as I do about that requirement for the swimming. And let me just show you the first slide. I'm going to show you some quick stats. Oh, as I go through this, some of this, because I've given these lectures a number of times, I may use the word, marriage success and stuff like that. But what I'm really doing here is talking about what I think are essentials to relationship success. And so in that sense, it's a good follow-up to John Van Epp's talk, where he's talking about how not to marry a jerk and how to avoid that. What I'm going to be talking about is how not to be a jerk. In other words, how to be a more mature person in relationships and how to do that. I know in some ways I'm kind of lecturing the choir of people that want to be loving and good people, but it actually turns out that's not so easy to do. But I am going to be talking both about marriage and relationships. So 90% of Americans will marry. 50%, as was said before, will end in divorce, and more in second and third marriages. And then this is the important point here. Marital success augments general well-being, physical health, and economic success. So if you succeed in this area, there's a lot of benefits. And then, of course, we know the downside: marital conflict, unhappiness, divorce. You get declines in all those areas, including in the next generation. Okay, now, when people have studied happiness, what contributes to happiness? So if you take a correlation between a composite measure of happiness and general well-being, income turns out to be important. Now, for those of you that haven't taken statistics, you need to know that what this little r is. It's a correlation coefficient. Correlation coefficients go between +1, which means that two events always happen together. -1 means they never happen together. And 0, which means that they're totally randomly related to each other. So income is a significant correlate of happiness. Of course, there's many people, if you're out of a job, it's very hard to maintain your happiness. Social support turns out to be more important. R is 0.35. But then the reason I'm showing you the slide is that positivity in intimate relationships is 0.79. So it's tremendously important. And then just in case so you won't ever forget this point, I love this slide because it shows people that are obviously not doing that well economically. By my count, there's five people on this bike, and they're all having a great time. They've been able to manage their relationship happiness. Okay, so then on a more personal note, this is I didn't want to scare you off with my divorce. This was my happy marriage. This is us on Valentine's Day. I'm kind of a romantic. 29 years ago. And this is last New Year's Eve, 3 daughters later. Okay, so then we talk a little bit about education for marriage. You know, you think about it, it seems like it's obvious we ought to do it. I mean, you wouldn't want a surgeon operating on you if they hadn't had any education in it. And even for simpler things that don't matter as much, like unless you're a professional musician, playing a musical instrument, starting a business is relevant because it's well known that many beginning businesses fail, and that people shouldn't just go into that without any knowledge. That's partly what business schools are about. And we need a license for driving. Why not for marriage? Okay, so there's the question, and we're about to show the first video. Question is, why not? I think the answer is what I'm going to call excessive romantic optimism. The idea that if you just find the right person, in other words, if you listen to this morning and you avoid marrying a jerkette, then you're set. Another way to think of this, I think, is the model of the roller coaster ride, which I think is what a lot of people consider marriage to be like. If you go to an amusement park, near where I live, there's a park called Great America. You go with somebody you like. Ideally, you'd go with a friend. You'd go with not the jerkette. But then you go on the roller coaster, you know, and you're there together, and you go to the top, and then it's this up and down ride, and you're totally passive. You have no control over what's going to happen, and that's the way the ride goes. I think that's the way a lot of people think of marriage. It's sort of like you find the right person. This is the way romantic comedies go, where they end with a marriage. And that's all you need to know. So I think this is one of the reasons. And to illustrate this point, I want to show a clip from the movie The Story of Us, which at the beginning of this movie shows a very romantic couple, Bruce Willis, Michelle Pfeiffer, who aren't doing so well. It's on the eve of their separation.
See, to me, the most romantic love stories ever were the ones you meet, fall in love, and then 50, 60 years later, one of them dies, and then a few days after that, the other one dies because they just can't get over the relationship. That's such a good example of a happy ending. I mean, you got two dead people in that example, but that's how it's thought into that opinion. It's not really dead, but
so the romantic optimism thing, I think also it's sort of like sex education. People felt that people already know these things, they should learn them in their family. They should know about relationships from growing up. And I think what we know is that's likely to lead to, I mean, realistically, there's a tremendous high divorce rate. And you wouldn't necessarily want to learn from people who hadn't made it work. Oh, Mia using the microphone. Oh, can we do the microphone? This is me using the microphone. I was wondering whether we can.
Can we say cut it off? Or turn it off so we can hear the
That's better. It's not on. Might be me. get the lights. Is it possible to get the lights down too? I don't know. There's...
On our first anniversary, I gave Ben a plastic spoon. You know, the takeout kind from a Chinese restaurant. Well, it was the one we had used when we shared our first bowl of wonton soup in the park. He was afraid he'd lost it, and I remember how his face lit up when he opened the little jewelry box that he'd wrapped it in. I keep asking myself, when is that moment in a marriage when a spoon becomes just a spoon?
When I first met Katie, I was working as a writer on this comedy show, and she had been hired as a temp. And, you know, it's hard to explain. There was an instant connection, this simpatico. I felt like she just got me. And believe me, there is no greater feeling in this world than to feel gotten.
I think the loudest silences are the ones filled with everything that's been said. Said wrong, said 300 times. You're not really hearing me.
Damn critic.
It's hard enough with two children. I don't need a third.
Oh, that's right. You're perfect, and I've done nothing right in 15 years.
You're not listening.
You can't let go of anything.
Never listen.
Hold on to every little thing.
Why should you be responsible for anything?
Every fucking thing.
I'll just take care of everything.
Fine.
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 Fine. Until fighting becomes the condition rather than the exception. And suddenly, without you even knowing it, it turns into the language of the relationship, and your only option is a silent retreat to neutral corners.
So it's actually very sad opening to the movie, and maybe we'll show you a little bit more. And those of you who want to have see how these guys do, I recommend the movie. It's really excellent. But my plan for today is to now having mentioned why I think marriage education is so important. Am I in the middle? Oh, yeah, here we go. I can do it. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is we're going to have some education, and I'm going to, since there's so many things that I could cover, I thought what I would do is talk about self-awareness as the most important thing, and I'm going to offer some suggestions, and then we'll have some Q&A on that. And then I'm going to talk about how to manage conflict in committed relationships. Okay, so as John mentioned earlier, there's many qualities that you would want in a partner, and most of them I'm not going to be talking about. I mean, you would want someone who was persistent or persevered. You'd want someone that was honest. There's many positive qualities you would want in a partner. Why am I going to emphasize self-awareness? And I'm also going to talk about love. That's the one at the end. But in terms of self-awareness, when we designed the marriage course, one of the things we did was we asked 20 experienced couples therapists what you would want after all your years of dealing with couples like I have, what you would want undergraduates to have in a class. And they somewhat surprised us. They wanted to have self-awareness in the course. And I'll try to tell you why that is really quickly. One thing is it's something you can improve. You can't change your basic temperament, but you can work on self-awareness. The other reason is pretty obvious. If you're blind to who you are, you're likely to simplify things and blame other people. As an example, in the realm of the senses, like if you went to a movie theater, like let's say you went to this one, and you forgot your glasses, but you knew you forgot your glasses, you wouldn't blame the projectionist. I think, I'm sorry, I apologize for the problems we've had so far, but you wouldn't blame the projectionist. Now, if you didn't know that that was the case, you might blame the projectionist. People do this all the time in their emotional lives. They forget that they're upset about the fact that they were just, the teacher just gave them a hard time in class, or their mom was on the phone with them and criticized them, or they were disappointed with an exam or an upcoming athletic event, or something was on their mind, and that tended to leak out and affect other relationships or events later in the day. And this is tremendously important, as we'll see later, in relationships. Okay. One other reason why self-awareness is important is a lot of thought is unconscious. This is one of Freud's great discoveries. And if we want to update it to the modern age, you can think of your computers, which have default settings that are set, like applications have those settings before as you put them on your computer. You may not even know they're there. My wife definitely does not know they're there, but that they're settings that are there. Now, they're like computer preferences. And for people, we all have these. We can think of them as inner maps of the world. The parts that I'm going to talk about today are very fond to psychoanalysts. They are our hopes, our fears, and our defense mechanisms. And at the end of this section of the talk, these are the 3 questions that I want you to ask yourselves. They're in the handout. What unfinished problem or personality weakness are you looking for your partner to solve? That's one. So this is potentially unconscious default setting. What are you most afraid will happen in your relationships? And what are your characteristic means of defending yourself? Okay, those are the 3 questions. In the class at Northwestern, we actually have groups where people discuss these things, but this is homework for you guys. Okay, so let's talk about unconscious hopes, and then there are many of these, but the ones I'm going to talk about relate to partner selection, and to one version of partner selection where you can get in trouble with your hopes is to solve past problems. This was one of Freud's great discoveries. He called it the repetition compulsion, and this would be a classic would be, say, the daughter or son of an alcoholic. Having been traumatized by that situation, you'd think the first thing they would do is they would stay away from anybody that had any drinking problem. And often they do. But just as often what you see is someone essentially dating somebody with a drinking problem and hoping to cure them. So there's a kind of a repeat with an attempt to make the story come out with a happy ending. Terrence Real, who's one of the references at the back of the handout, he calls this simply unfinished business. I think that's almost common terminology. Okay, another one is partner selection to solve current problems. This is the idea of opposites attract and later divorce. Now, a certain amount of complementarity, like in John's marriage, is fine. In other words, he talked about his wife rubbing off on him, and I think she succeeded. I mean, the guy is very outgoing, not the shy man he was in college. So opposites. But the thing is if somebody's really opposite to you and you think they're going to solve your problems, if you're very shy, and you may not want to go to all the parties they want to go to later, you'll find it actually a problem. And in fact, if you were a couples therapist and you got to ask one question of somebody about to predict what was going to be the problem they were going to tell you about in the first interview, it would be paradoxical. It would be what most attracted you to this person, because it's most likely to cause problems later. And one way to look at this is what's sort of whimsically called fatal attractions, and I'll give you a couple examples of these. He married her because she was so delicate and cute, but he divorced her because she was so weak and helpless. So it's the same character trait that was admired has its downside. She married him because he was such a strong man. She divorced him because he was domineering. She married him because she was steady and sensible. Divorced her because she was boring and dull. You know, in the clip, the George Willis character, who's I think modeled on Rob Reiner's dad. Rob Reiner, the director of that movie, is a very comical guy, but what he needs to he's not paying attention. He thinks that she gets him and she likes his humor, but she doesn't just do that. He's interrupting her work. And later in the movie, you see over and over again how different they are and how they have terrible troubles integrating his humorousness with her work ethic. Bless you. Anyway. She married him because he was the life of the party. She divorced him because he wouldn't stop partying. So these are examples of, you should know, and then the summary version from Terrence Real is, perhaps you married your mate to steady you, to be successful for you, to give you value, abundance, culture, all these things. And all these things are wonderful, they're great as gifts, but they're poison as obligations, or as essentially what I think of it as marrying somebody or dating somebody to deal with your own problem. So the solution, the actual thing you ought to be doing is working on your own range of possibilities. Grow yourself rather than date the person. Okay, so how do you find out what your unconscious hopes and expectations are? How do you answer question number one? Ask yourself, whom have I actually been attracted to in my life? What problem, issue, fear, or defect in myself might this be an attempt to solve? In other words, look at yourself not in terms of what you think you've done, but what have you actually done? In other words, what of those default settings, what have they been driving you to do? Okay, so now we move on to the second question, your unconscious fears. And I suppose the audience has to overcome their fear of revealing themselves, but when you're in relationships, what are you afraid might happen? How might you get hurt? How have you been hurt? So who would like to be brave and say how they've been hurt in a relationship? Or what are they afraid? What are you afraid will happen to you? Yeah.
Stop loving me.
Yeah, the person stops, that initial love goes away, right? I mean, yeah, absolutely. And anything else? What else do you guys think? Yes? Being taken for granted. Similar to being not loved, but yeah. And that often, we'll see later, often some advice is, I've had people in therapy yell at each other, why can't you treat me like a stranger? Because people treat strangers sometimes better than they do their intimate partners. They take them for granted, yeah. Somebody else? What else are you afraid of? You guys are so healthy. Actually, everybody's afraid of all of these a little bit. What else are you afraid of? not be able to trust them, to rely on. That was one of John's points, is that trust, how important trust is, but you might be with somebody you can't trust when the chips are down. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Not knowing, you're afraid that you didn't see what was coming, or that you're surprised by some bad thing that happens? Well, that people would change, right, and that you wouldn't have discovered them. I know John's talk, again, emphasizes the at least 3-month waiting period, and he mentioned his parents didn't know each other very long. My parents, one of the mistakes my mom always mentioned was that she didn't know my dad. She met my dad, it was like right after World War II. She met him during the fall, and they got engaged somewhere in February, and she never knew him during the tennis season. And he was this total tennis addict, and she didn't see this coming at all. So actually, I think I'd go for at least a year, get all those seasons. Okay, so what else? Being cheated on, yeah, being hurt that way. It's a kind of loss of love in the extreme, and loss of trust, yeah. I think really the abandonment thing, in other words, the one-way love is a common thing, that you'll be, it connects with unfaithfulness, but it's that you put your energy and your investment in a relationship and it's not reciprocated, or the person is disloyal. Sure. Anything else? How about the flip side of that? Yeah. Being used. Like, in what way? In other words, not really love, just used for a particular aspect, like if you were. I mean, I think that actually this is the problem of actually some people that are tremendously wealthy or beautiful, or they have some quality that they think it's highly likely people are attracted to. They often have trouble feeling like the relationship is really genuine and not just a situation of being used. It's like when people laugh at the boss's jokes, is it really that they were that funny, or is it just that it's the boss? So anyway, so let's move on. Let's see how many we got. This is my list of unconscious fears. Rejection or abandonment. If we think of the attachment system, it's attachment panic. This definitely, we got this one. Criticism, I don't think anybody really, I think we mentioned it kind of, but criticism, whether it's unfair or accurate, I think this turns out to be a big problem in marriages. Being controlled. This group, I think, is so malleable or something. You're not afraid of being, maybe there's nobody out there enough afraid of being controlled. We didn't get that. Invasion of your free time or space is sort of similar to being controlled. Emotional demands, this one I might have expected from this audience, that emotional demands exceed your capacity to manage them. In other words, you're married to someone who becomes very depressed or needy, or just is always wanting to be dependent on you. Or the reverse of that is acting in ways that we find abhorrent, or being inept, hurting the other person. Now, Rail has a nice way of talking about this idea of unconscious fears. He says what that is, and this is one way you can get at yours, is that vision of him or her that you feel most hopeless or frightened about. You say to yourself in those furious or resigned or terrified moments, oh my God, what if he or she really is a vicious person, a cold-hearted witch, a betrayer, incompetent, constricted, selfish? Your CNI is what he calls it, is your worst nightmare. It is who your partner becomes in those most difficult, irrational, least loving moments. Okay. So I'll give you an example. This is from my wife and I. We have our worst fights in the car. And this problem has fortunately been solved recently by GPS. It's just great. Occasionally you can solve problems with technology, and this has been one, but we've been struggling with it for 30 years. With our kids in the back seat, complaining about, oh my God, they're doing it again. So anyway, so here's how it goes though. I had the misfortune of my mom was quite depressed when I was a kid, and literally my two earliest memories are being lost, and it was highly traumatic when I was 2 years old, and then a little bit later than that, 3 years old. And in addition, often my mom would promise things, including that she knew the directions to places, and not deliver on them. And so it's sort of in my unconscious is this terrifying fear of some combination of being lost or the person promising something then can't deliver on it. So when I'm driving and we're at about exit 16 and we're not sure whether we have to get off at exit 17 or 18 or where we're going on the Indiana Turnpike in the middle of a snowstorm, and my wife is sitting there with the directions, I start to get, let us say, not the nicest guy that you would want to be sitting next to. And what was happening to her? Well, she had the misfortune of having a dad who was a physics professor and who just loved to talk to her about her math. And she wasn't very good at math. She isn't here, I can say that. She's also not very good at maps. I get to say that on these public things. But she's worse at maps and math because when she starts to be expected to do that by like me as the father figure here, she literally freezes up just like she did as a kid. So we're in this awful situation, and I would submit that this is what happens to lots of couples. They have simultaneously their core negative images, their worst fears, are happening at the same time. They're both drowning at the same time. I'm terrified we're going to be lost, and Sheila's sitting there terrified that she's going to be traumatized by Dad. Okay. And it doesn't have to be, I should say this, it doesn't have to be the mother transference, the father transference, what analysts would call it. It can be you can have it to the same-sex parents. So your most traumatic thing might have been with your dad if you're a guy, or if you're with your mom if you're a woman. It just turned out that way in our case. Okay, so here's some adverse outcomes of this. You can have too much safety as a result. In other words, if you know what you're afraid of, one way that people deal with their fears is to make things too safe. Now, personally, this was how I messed up, and part of how I messed up in my first marriage. Because as people mentioned, one of the things that can happen is you can be jilted, you can be rejected. And I had two extremely traumatic breakups, one of them very close to here, at this lecture hall. And it comes back, right? So without really getting it through my head, it's like I think at the point that I was about feeling like I ought to get married, as I'm graduating from medical school, I was involved with a woman who I thought made lots of sense. We fit in many ways. She ended up being a sociology professor, and we had many things in common. But I really wasn't in love with her, and there were other problems that I won't go into. But in the basic thing was I was pretty sure she wouldn't jilt me. And so I think what I did was I went for something that was too safe and then turned out to be a problem. It was kind of one of those fatal attractions. Jerry Seinfeld, I think, is an example of the guy who can't commit out of fears that we don't really get a sense of. That's the running joke on the Seinfeld show, right? There's always something wrong. The girls laugh, or it's too loud, or she talks too low, or her hands look wrong, or there's always something wrong with her, rather than with Jerry. Okay, so repetition is another one. Never-ending attempt to relive or master the fear. That's the repetition compulsion I talked about before. And the third is externalization. You blame your partner. Of course, that's what Sheila and I do in the car. I blame her. She can't, read maps or prepare or admit that she can't read maps, and she blames me for being a complete jerk. And we're both right. But in a way to think of this is it's like blaming the pitcher for the pitch you can't hit. So the way to grow yourself is to try to master your fears. That's one thing. So here we go. How do you discover yours? How do you answer question number 2? You notice situations that repetitively drive you nuts, like me in the car. That's one. You ask, what is the emotional pitch I can't hit? These are all variations on the same questions. If somebody gets angry with me, these are common ones. I can't handle somebody being angry with me. Another one is I can't tell you how many men in my office can't get totally unhinged by their wife crying. They cannot handle what I call the crying woman. What's the emotional pitch I can't hit? And then Rael's OMG question. Consider the most, now here's the last one is a little less obvious. Consider the most distasteful characteristic, your childhood caretakers. That's easy for me, that was my mom and had these defects. But the last one is a little less obvious. Notice your repetitive criticisms of others. Now, we all know, you read the news, the people that are the most sanctimonious about this or that, it's true that like a couple weeks later or months later, you find them indicted for just exactly, or there's a huge scandal for just exactly what they were complaining about. And I think that's not a coincidence. It's because they're dealing with that issue in themselves. They're trying to externalize it onto others. So you could try to find out what your big fear is by noticing what you're always criticizing in others. Okay, so we move on to coping and defense mechanisms. Human beings, when afraid of being hurt, cope well or poorly with their fears. And when these are adaptive, we call them coping mechanisms, including self-awareness is a big one, that emphasizing here. Help-seeking is another, being able to ask directions, for instance. Okay, maladaptive strategies are called defense mechanisms. Okay, these are also unconscious often. They take the form of fight and flight. And like our hopes and fears, you learned them in childhood, like you learned the language you grew up with. And they explain problems in managing conflict. Okay, so here's some problems with them. The problem with defenses is they're like the problems with drugs. And I don't just mean recreational drugs. I mean like, therapeutic drugs. The problems with these drugs are often their side effects. So you might give a person a drug for their high blood pressure, but then it has an adverse effect on their liver. So it depends on what the side effects are, what sort of problems you're going to have with these defenses. Because then essentially the attempted solutions become the problems. So to give you a couple examples of defenses, people who avoid others out of fear of becoming dependent will become lonely. So whatever Jerry's afraid of, he's not going to get a relationship going. People who will do anything to maintain a relationship, in other words, these are the overly dependent people, sacrifice personal integrity and self-esteem. Okay, knowing your defenses helps. Why? That you are experiencing some psychological danger, your CNI, that you should try to identify. So by now, my wife and I identify that situation. And we say things like, well, wouldn't you like to turn on the GPS? That would be good. Or we let the kid drive, or one of the kids reads the map, or there's ways around it, but you need to see it coming. So that continuing your defense is likely to make matters worse. You should try to cope in some healthier manner. Okay. Now here's another. So this is the funny version that actually happens to apply to automobile imagery. So Rael's thing is when the immature parts of your personality become triggered, in your mind's eye, take that child in your lap, put your arms around him, love him, and take his sticky hands off the steering wheel. I love that. Okay, now here's one that might be a little less obvious. Knowing your partner's defenses, what they usually do, also can help you. Because it allows you to know when they get activated why you're having so much trouble with him or her. In other words, when my wife freezes up, which is very rare for her, she's a very competent social worker, attorney. That's why I picked her, actually. The second time around, I was going to definitely pick someone that I could count on, and the car thing is probably one of the few exceptions. But if you know your partner's defenses, you'll know why you're having trouble. It allows you to turn up the empathic listening. It allows you to work against your partner's negative image of you. Okay. Now, for years I gave this lecture on self-awareness in the Marriage 101 class at Northwestern because I really am a fan of this, and this is part of what psychoanalysis is about. It's about the examined life being better, not just worth living, but being a vast improvement. But I got to say that self-awareness is limited, and there are other things that go into maturity, as I mentioned earlier, and it's insufficient for a healthy marriage. And what I don't have time to do enough on today or do justice to, but I want to say something about love as a verb. In other words, not quite the same as falling madly for somebody where you idealize them and they're going to solve your problems or you're going to have wonderful sexual relationship or just the pleasures of intimacy. I'm talking about concern, empathy, charity, caritas, loving the other. Like Eric Fromm is a psychoanalyst who wrote a book, The Art of Loving, which this is the kind of love he was talking about. Okay, here's where the boundary of yourself moves to surround that of the other person, which just means, and this is in the reference, Goldbart and Wallen is an excellent book on this, but the idea is that when you're unhappy, when your partner's unhappy, you're unhappy. When your partner's happy, you're happy. It's somewhat like with your children. It is like with your children. So this is an aspect of love. So you are attentive to the other guy and their needs. But this is tremendously dependent on self-understanding. So having yourself under control, knowing when your allergies, your emotional allergies, your fears, your defenses are active. I don't think you can be a loving person without some of the things that I was talking about before. And this is related to the idea of why relationships are hard work. We want to show the Lars thing. So, and when you talk to people, one of the things that I do in my class is we have everybody, they get to interview a couple in the community, and we give them a protocol of questions where they talk to these people that have been married 20 some years about their relationships. And universally what happens in these interviews is couples will say, or married couples will say, you know, marriage is often hard work. And for years I've tried to figure out, what did they mean? What sort of hard work? Why should it be so hard? I think a lot of, certainly when I was in college, I didn't think it was going to be hard work. And I think actually one of the unconscious attitudes that I didn't mention that many people have is that it shouldn't be work. It should be the opposite of work. In other words, when you're at work or when you're out there with the strangers that you treat well, you are on your best behavior. You're trying to get along. You're making an effort. When you get home, then you don't need to do that anymore. You should be able to stop doing that. Actually, this is terrible advice. I mean, everybody needs some of that. John Gray talks about the cave. The guy needs to be in his cave. This is true, but it's a huge distortion of what you need to do when things are tough. When there's a conflict, you actually need to show restraint. And so then this is what I want to do is if we can show this, and hopefully the audio will work. There's a wonderful scene from this movie, Lars and the Real Girl. And hold on just a sec to show it. And what this scene is, the background is there's this one, Lars is a very disturbed young man, very sort of schizoid, isolated, and he surprises and somewhat shocks everybody in his community because one day he comes home with a blow-up sex doll. That's the real girl. But it's pretty obvious right on that it isn't really about the usual blow-up sex doll thing. It's more like a kid's teddy bear, a transitional object that Lars attaches to. And in the movie, it's a wonderful movie. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. But it's a therapeutic thing with the whole community takes on this case of Lars and helps him with it. But within the movie, Lars has a scene where he asks his older brother, when did the brother know he was a real man? When was he grown up? What does it mean to be mature? And I hope you can see this scene.
I was talking to Bianca, and she was saying that in her culture they have these rites of passage, there's rituals and ceremonies, and just all kinds of things, you know, that when you do them, at least when you're done, if you live through them, that you know that you're an adult. Doesn't that sound right?
It does. I don't know. I don't know what.
That you were a man.
Nah, I couldn't tell you.
What? Okay, what was the text?
Yeah. It's it's kind of no. Well, it's kind of sex, but it's not. You know. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah, but I have to know.
Hold that thought. Maybe you should ask Dagmar.
I did ask Dagmar, and she said that I should ask you.
Okay, I can only give you my opinion.
That's all I want.
Well, it's not like you're all one thing or the other, okay? There's still a kid inside, but you grow up when you decide to do right, okay? And not what's right for you, what's right for everybody, even when it hurts.
Okay, like what?
Like, you don't jerk people around, and you don't cheat on your woman, and you take care of your family, you admit when you're wrong, or you try to anyways. That's all I can think of, It sounds like it's easy, and for some reason it's not.
I know, because nothing's easy.
It's like the old man. You didn't have to take care of 2 kids alone. You could have given us to an orphanage or something, people do that. But he loved us, and he tried to do right, even though he didn't know how, and even though he had a broken heart. I shouldn't have left you alone with him. He was too sad. It scared me, and I just ran. It's selfish. And I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You've crossed the line.
Well, you kept swiping
So
my
one of the reasons I love that scene is not only does it agree with what I think, which is always good, and it's so well done, but that the brother is doing it. He's not just defining it and struggling with the question and saying that great line, for some reason it's harder to do, it sounds easy, but it's hard to do. But what is he doing? He's doing the wash, he's making a meal, and then he apologizes. He apologizes, which is another thing that's hard to do and makes marriages go, is when you can say you're sorry, which he does to his brother for having run out on him when he was a little boy. So it's great to see somebody actually doing it. Let's see. Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the question and answer thing right now and just move on to the next section if we get there. No. But we should probably. So the next, okay, here we go, love. All right. Okay. So we're going to talk about conflict in committed relationships. Now, why is this an important topic? There's a bunch of reasons. One is conflict's inevitable. Even if I once treated a guy who was an identical twin, who one of the things he taught me, his identical twin was his best friend, and he was married to, the two of them both had marriages, they lived nearby, they had wonderful times together. I was often envious of them. But they shared values and pretty much everything, so they were totally compatible guys. But they had a lot of conflicts because they would differ on, like, should we go out tonight, or I don't really want to go to this movie, but that one would be good. So, even if you're identical, conflict's going to come up, but it definitely comes up in marriages. It's actually, in terms of actual research on marital success, as per John Gottman, it's the best predictor of whether people are going to be successful and happy and not get divorced. And the other reason is conflict mishandled obviously erodes good things. Maybe less obvious if it's handled well, it deepens the marital bond. And here's the bad news. Most people are not good at handling conflict. The good news is conflict management skills can be learned and improved, and also that it's applicable in other relationships. So again, I'm not just talking about marriage here. This will help you, or intimate relationships. This will help you with your boss, with your in-laws, with other people, with your friends, with your roommates. Okay, now hopefully we could show, sorry, I should have given her the lead on this, But what I want you to do is, maybe I'll anticipate a little bit. What I'm going to say is we're going to talk about conflict independent of content. So obviously there are certain areas. If you ask people, like what causes divorce, they almost always will say it's something like fights over sex, money, and kids. Those are the 3 top ones. And in fact, it turns out surveys show that couples have the most trouble with those issues. But I think really the way to think about these things is not so much the content areas, but independent of content, the way people fight. It's the process as opposed to the content. The music is as important as the words. And so what I'm going to be doing in this last part of this lecture is talking about what we know about sort of fighting fair and not fighting fair, good, healthy process and unhealthy process. And this first clip is again from The Story of Us. And it's a tremendous example if you'll be able to hear it. I don't know. Can you guys hear it in the back? Were you able to hear Lars? You could hear Lars? Okay. So in this, you'll see 2 people who are saying tremendously important things to each other. So it's not like they're not accessing their deep stuff as per the first part. I mean, they know their deeper stuff. They're just totally talking past each other. And it ends in a very contemptuous moment. So hopefully we'll be able, no? It's not working? The problem is we were going to do this with a VHS where it was already there, but we have to fast forward. Maybe I can try to zoom ahead here. Okay, so now you've seen that wonderful clip, and you've got the idea of what you don't want to do, which we'll get to it. But before we get into the actual before we get into the process, let me say a couple things about what triggers these conflicts in my experience. And I've sort of become a connoisseur of these things over the years, all the things that can trigger marital conflict and how they go. And one of them is the loaded important topics that I just mentioned, sex, love, and kids. That seems obvious. Another one, though, is underlying sensitivities and issues. In other words, the core negative images that I was talking about before. This tends to be a tremendous, it not only explains why things start, it's why things start over who's loading the dishwasher right, or somebody who forgot to put the garage door down. It's not just about the garage door. I want you all to remember this, okay? Tomorrow or years from now or whenever, you'll have some fight and it'll seem over stupid things. A lot of times people come to me and they say, I can't believe it, we're having fights over nothing. Well, it's always because the nothing is the tip of the iceberg that is the entryway into the deeper concerns as to whether somebody's loved, whether they're respected, whether they're listened to, whether they have any votes, whether women are equal to men. I mean, all of the big issues. So that's the second thing to say. The third thing about what feeds these conflicts is the problem of joint decision making, or what I call the problem of co-captains. It's why boats have only one captain, if you think about it. Okay, so hopefully, we gonna? No? Didn't work? Okay. Nuts. Do you want to, okay, how about it, could you take this preps clip? Let's see. Actually, I had, darn it. Okay. See if you can get that open, and then I'll show you. I've got another thing I show. Anyway, so joint decision making, co-captains. In this contemporary age where men and women each get a vote, and there isn't an obvious decisions around, the men decide around the money and the women decide around the kids. I mean, you can work that out. I mean, in traditional marriages, often that's how the decisions are divided. But the idea of how you break a tie between 2 people is often challenging. The fourth thing in terms of starters and maintainers of conflict is what I call the wear and tear of living with someone. One friend of mine who's a famous couples therapist said that he thought that almost any 2 people, you put them under the same roof, would start to have problems with each other. And it's partly because there's just this wear and tear. All of you know that if you've had roommates, it's much harder with those people than it is with your, quotes, friends outside. Another example of that is sort of silly. It's like if your friend tells you you're having lunch and your friend says, I'm going to give up my job at the law firm. This is older friends. I mean, most of you don't have friends like that. But if your friend said this to you, you have to imagine, okay? Your friend says to you, I'm going to give up my job at the law firm, and I've always wanted to be a poet, and I'm going to pursue my dream, okay? And you say to your friend, wow, that sounds great. Go for it. You go, girl. It's great. So, but if you're married to her, and that's a major part of your income, I mean, there's a different deal. So when you're more bonded to someone, and when you're living under the same roof, and when you've got your whole life going with somebody, there's much more riding on their decision to drop out of the law firm. Okay, the other one is outside stress comes home. Very often, we're all stressed. One of my sort of rule of thumb is if you're having terrible troubles dating somebody, you probably should seriously consider that this is not a good relationship, because dating shouldn't be that hard. Marriage is when you get the real problems come up. Somebody gets sick, somebody loses their job, the grandmother moves in with you, the kid has some rare disease. Whatever it is, or some not so rare disease called adolescence. So there's. I love John's comment about he had kids because they were so interesting. Mine have been very interesting too. but anyway, moving right along. So outside stress comes home. So sometimes what people do in that situation is they blame their spouse. So one that might be not that obvious is a woman recently got cancer, and you'll see her blaming her husband for being relatively insensitive. And whatever the guy might have been somewhat insensitive, I think it was a cover for she's terrified she's going to die. See, so and the guy comes home from a stressful day, the old joke was, kicks the dog, insults the kids, beats up the wife, whatever. So people will blame their spouse for their problems, in other words, for the pitch they can't hit that's outside the home. And the last one for conflict triggers was unrealistic wishes and beliefs, which I already talked about. The idea that when you come home, you shouldn't have to be on your good behavior. You should be able to be totally taken care of. There's a child psychiatrist called Anthony Wolfe who has written some wonderful books about raising kids, and he talks about the baby self as the kid at home wants to be totally taken care of. And I think a lot of us, when we come home, that's what we want, and we don't think we should have to behave ourselves. Okay, so then if we look at the anatomy of destructive fights, this is when, I'm going to say, when things go bad, it's almost always the process of the relationship that goes bad. This is another audience participation one. Okay, guys. When you imagine your latest big row with somebody, okay? Could be your mom, could be your dad, could be your roommate, could be your boyfriend, your girlfriend. Just, think of it in your mind. Think of it how it went. What did it feel like? Has everybody got one? Most of you if you think of one? You've never had one? You've all had one, okay. So you're thinking of them, sort of like me in the car, okay? You're thinking of it, and what I want you to tell me is what did it feel like, and what did you do that made it worse? There's sort of two questions, but so any takers? Come on. No? What? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, what? They'll start with stay there. That's what a lot of people will say. I don't remember. It was just awful. What else next? Don't remember how it started. Yeah, that's awful.
I was arguing with my brother.
Yeah.
And voices were being raised, and it started to get heated, and I pushed my brother.
And you pushed him,
and
yeah.
that made it a lot worse.
Okay, yeah, very good, of course. It's really boiled down. That's wonderful. It's really boiled down because we get out of that as escalation, which is one of the terrible things that happens. Like things go worse and worse. It's like a nuclear reaction, getting worse. And one explanation for that is that people are functionally deaf. That's why voices start getting raised. It's like when people are talking to someone in a coma, you'll see people raise their voice like the person could hear you if you talk louder. It's not true. But you see that all the time. You see that with couples. They raise their voice. And then when words don't work, it's like countries. They go to war. They bring out the tanks, and they sometimes push each other. They yell at each other. They insult each other. They do something to try to hurt the other guy. Okay? That's very good. You actually get about a 4 for, and if I had a T-shirt, you would get one or 2. That was great. Anybody else? Yeah.
Instead of dealing with the person you actually have the problem with, you go talk to everyone else who has the same problem with the person and just vent and gossip about it instead of actually addressing it.
That's wonderful. You get a T-shirt too, because that actually was. That's not even on my list. I've got this comprehensive list, and that one wasn't on it. But it's a variation of avoidance or flight from the actual person. So that is on my list. But the idea of gossiping with other people who often will take your side. Actually, there's an article I read in the past year by Michelle Weiner Davis, who probably John knows, but where she talked about the potential dangers of women talking to their women friends, complaining about their marriages, and how sometimes that's good because the women friends want to talk about relationships way more than the guys do. But if they go, yeah, he's such an asshole, he's such a jerk. I can't believe you're married to him, It can make it worse if they're avoiding the person they should be fighting with. Yes. Others. Yeah.
She'll like make me doubt myself. Like she'll turn around the story and then I think I'm just overreacting over something that didn't happen after all. Like I'm like, wait, maybe that didn't happen.
So that's great. Okay, so.
And then I just get more angry because I know that I was upset. And
Right.
She makes it seem like I overreacted.
You start to blame yourself, and you start to doubt yourself.
Yeah.
That's really good. See, now you have your roommate. Will take your roommate doing what she's doing wrong, because what she's doing is she's cross-complaining, or she's blaming the other guy rather than addressing whatever the issue is. You'll see people say, "Well, you do the same to me," and as if that matters. I mean, if I spilled on something on you, you can't say, "Well," like I can't say. You spilled on me once. You should say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I spilled on you. And the business about self-doubt is a real common one where people begin to doubt themselves and collapse. It's a kind of collapse in the face of a powerful defense, and it's not healthy. We could talk a long time about that, but that's not an uncommon situation. Others? Other things people do? What else do people do? Yeah.
Sometimes if somebody says something like really mean, I just pretend they didn't say it.
That's great. That's what my dad does. My dad does that. He says he doesn't, it's not even really mean. It's just something he doesn't like or agree with. And it got better when he had a hearing aid, because then he could kind of pretend they didn't hear me. But, there's a lot of people that just sort of go functionally deaf. They go, yeah, when's it going to be over? Yeah, okay. There's a variation of that is agreeing too quickly, but having no real commitment to doing what, I'll do that. Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay. Anything else? Yeah?
In my experience, when people get angry, they stop thinking.
Yes, that's very good. It's the ability to be, this is one of John Gottman's big findings, was that he actually hooked people up in this, he had a lab in Seattle, he called it the Love Lab, and he would have, there wasn't no love, he'd have these couples that he was studying have a sort of fight in his office. They'd talk about some issue that they differed on, and he hooked them up to cardiac monitors, and he checked their pulse and their galvanic skin response, and and then he talked to them also about how it felt. And all these guys, their heart, they would be immobilized, and they couldn't think. And some of them wouldn't be saying anything. Some would be yelling, but the ability to think when you're angry or when you're flooded is what he called it, being flooded. I think for lots of people, this is a huge problem, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as to what you should do about that. But yeah, the ability to think becomes compromised. Anything else? What else we notice? Yeah.
it becomes this kind of self-defensive mechanism. Like, well, I know I'm wrong, so I'm just gonna argue that I can argue with him. So then it becomes like, which one of us can be more sarcastic and accurate about the battle of argument?
I think that the argument is, if I got you right, first of all, it's two things. It's who can hurt the other guy, and the idea of winning, the idea that someone's going to win. It's like a debate in court. And when you're a couples therapist, over and over, people start, they get this. It's a wrong idea. They think that, okay, they're going to argue this thing out in front of me, and I'm going to vote, on who is wrong. And so lots of people in fights think that. And what you really should be thinking is, even if you win, you lose. Because it's like two people in a canoe. You're in this canoe together, and you can't, if you alienate the other guy, you got the whole rest of your life with that person. It's like, you have to think of it more like a team. So how to contain the anger and the desire just to win at any cost. I think a lot of people, if I could take off with that a little bit more, I think a lot of people in these fights will even disregard the facts they know make the other guy's case. Or that you find yourself exaggerating your side, even though you know it isn't right. You start being a little bit, your honesty goes out the window sometimes. Anything else? Yeah.
Whenever I've gotten into any kind of serious disagreement with someone or like a serious fight, I've always found that afterwards it was always really upsetting. Like it wasn't something that I could just later write off.
Right.
And that until this disagreement or this argument was in some way resolved, it was something that I couldn't forget.
Yeah, and that's really important. I mean, maybe what you just said is a fallout from it, how these things become destructive and long-lasting. This is the erosion of the good feelings in a marriage or a relationship. If you have enough of that stuff, this is what leads to divorce. That's my theory about the major causes of divorce, or my experience, I got to say. It's not just a theory. Is that this constant wear and tear of unfinished arguments that people really don't understand. They get caught up in them. They feel, I think that's the other thing. If you're honest with yourself, you feel like you're caught in something, you don't understand it. Partly it's because it's circular causation. In other words, it's very hard for people to think about two people interacting in a mature way when they're angry and the other guy's attacking. It's very difficult. So anyway, what I'm going to do now is first just maybe I'll zoom through my my list. How many did we get? You feel caught. It's hard to think. You're flooded. Feel victimized. Blame the other. Partner doesn't care. You become unable to empathize. You see your partner's words as excuses. You want to hurt, get revenge. And then there are variations on fight and flight. You got to win. You try to evoke guilt, or you flee. All these things we talked about. Okay. To say quick things about anger. Anger is a useful feeling, but it also can be destructive. So you got to think of it like other painful emotions like sadness, boredom, anxiety. If you have a pebble in your shoe and it hurts, it's telling you to do something. Okay. People that don't have that pain, like if you have diabetes and you have neuropathy and you don't feel that pebble, you'll get infections there. So it's a good thing in that sense. It's a signal to energize us to do something. But we've got choices to make. You can make constructive choices or destructive ones. And I've just used the example of untying a knot. We've all had like a knot in your shoelace, and you're in a big rush and you go, oh, just pull it. And it makes it worse. And what you got to do is you got to slow things down at that time. Chinese handcuffs I won't describe, but if you know what those are, you'll understand that. A common mistake for couples, and then I'm going to talk about what you should do, is doing what feels right in the moment, but it's wrong in the long term. Okay, so here's what you should do. And these are on your handout, so you can take them with you, study them, commit them to memory, try to do them. They're not so easy. Okay, so this is to make you a more mature person, not the jerk. Okay, moment of choice. Remind yourself you have power to make this better or worse. It's an at-bat, a fork in the road, a ball. I'm a pretty much addicted golfer, so I like this metaphor. When you're in the rough behind a tree, boy, you can make this thing worse or not. Okay, fight fair, not fight dirty. Remind yourself that safety and healthy process. Remember the process, not just the who's right and who's going to win this thing. Timing. there's obviously, everybody knows there's good times and bad times, but what often people think is there's no good, a lot of couples I see, you know, it's not a good time if they're in the middle of serious fights because they think it'll just make it worse. But then when things are going okay, they don't want to rock the boat, so there's never a good time. But sometimes you have to bite the bullet and approach the other person. Soft startups. Okay, so Gottman, one of his findings is, if you're going to begin one of these, if you finally decide this is the time, you ought to be like my wife Sheila. What she does with me is, I know when she's going to criticize me, because she always starts it out with a compliment. And so she'll go, Art, you know, this would be a while back when our kids were still at home. She'd go, you know, I think you just did a wonderful job with Cindy helping her with her homework. That's just so important that dads help their kids with their homework, you know, remembering her dad. And then it's really, I'm now getting more sense of where this story comes from. But she said, oh, you did such a great job with that. It's just that next time it would be better if you wouldn't give her the whole history of U.S. history or geometry or whatever it was. She doesn't need all of that. She's only got 30 minutes tonight for that. So starting out softly, compliment the person. You don't have to always compliment them, but it works for her. It works on me. Okay, so what do you do? So the next thing to do is to differentiate between being the speaker and listener and try to meet what I'm going to call the emotional challenges of each of these. First one is pay attention to which role you're in at the moment. It's kind of like in baseball, there's a pitcher and there's a batter. You don't have two pitchers or two batters. Imagine two pitchers throwing at each other. That's like what we get. The person who begins with a complaint is the speaker. Be aware that usually both people want to be the speaker, although some people want to opt out, so that'd be one speaker talking to nobody. You've got to take turns. This is a variation of that, you know, that old saw, I learned everything I needed to know, I learned in kindergarten. And this is, you got to take turns like if you were on the playground with the swing. Okay, here are the challenges for the listener. The emotional challenge. It's to maintain an empathic connection with someone who's upset, and it's harder if they're upset with you. And empathy is a whole topic for a whole lecture, but it really requires feeling yourself into the other guy's shoes without being overwhelmed. So if you take the example of an ER doctor, let's say somebody comes in after an auto accident, there's blood all over the place, and the doctor is so inert to being a doctor, he says, no, blood, that's nothing, who cares, you know, and goes on a coffee break. That wouldn't be good. That's totally the extreme of no empathy. But they can't be overly empathic either. They can be, oh my God, look at all the blood. Oh, I don't know what to do. I'm clueless. If you're as upset as the accident victim, that doesn't work. So empathy is something more like, it's like feeling it but not being it. It's like feeling your way in but not being as overwhelmed by it as the other guy. That's what you're shooting for. It's a differentiated stance. Those of you that have studied psychology may know about differentiation. You have to be comfortable with the emotions. If the person's crying, you have to be comfortable with that. If the person's angry at you, you have to be comfortable with angry or anxiety or whatever. Okay, challenges for the listener. Listening to criticism. I divide up the challenge listening, and this is probably the most difficult thing. Legitimate criticism. The ideal listener can accept personal responsibility. This is why you have to be a mature person, because immature people don't accept responsibility without undue guilt or shame. Okay, unfair criticism, however, this happens all the time. I mean, your spouse will take out on you stuff that really is related to something else. The ideal listener can manage the feeling of being unfairly blamed by seeing it as defensive and focusing instead on what's really upsetting the speaker. Now, the most common situation, there's some mix of these, which makes it more challenging. Okay, what are the challenges for the speaker? To communicate clearly a need, a complaint, or hurt without concealing it. Okay, to stand up for yourself without putting the other down. And this is the idea. You want to make them your ally. My wife wants to make me the ally. We're both helping our kids. You must be comfortable asking for things. It's amazing how it's not just the guys that can't ask for directions. It's in my experience, it's most people have terrible trouble asking for stuff and fearing rejection, and they'll hide it in lots of ways, which you'll see in a sec. Must resist the urge to hurt or seek revenge. Okay. This, actually, I think, to tell you the truth, I think this is the biggest reason why couples have trouble. These are really hard to do, as per the clip from Lars. It's the most important reason why marital harmony and conflict is so difficult. Okay, so more specifically, what should you do? Avoid certain language choices. Don't use hyperbole. You always or you never. Even if it feels like that, don't say that. You can say you often. It's way less inflammatory. And it doesn't let the other guy say, oh, no, that's not right. Last week I, mowed the lawn, whatever. Okay, don't use one-sided arguments, one that leave out obvious truths. Don't swear or attack the other person's character. Don't argue that others agree with you, because obviously there's going to be people that don't. Don't argue that others do it your way again, other people don't. Don't argue you should be forgiven or topic drop because the other, I already mentioned this one. People do this. I'm sure most of you, I've done all of these, I think. Don't argue from, look what else I've done for you, you should do this for me. In other words, don't pull that one. Let's see, don't argue from, I do it for you. Don't argue from, if you really love me, you would. This one is a real common one. And so, because the other guy could say, well, if you really loved me, you wouldn't ask me to do it. Don't argue from absolutes or shoulds. Okay, so this is summarizing this. Most appeals, I would say, to ethics, rules, authorities, friends, relations, function to conceal the ask of asking, the relativism of the request, and the danger of refusal. So you should be ashamed that you didn't whatever. Everyone knows that you should. Doctor or expert. I get this all the time on my pet. Dr. Nielsen said you should do this. Says that husbands, wives ought to. Are ways to avoid, honey, I would really like it if you would. Okay, so now here's what should you say? Personalize your requests rather than cloaking them in appeals to virtue logic. That's the opposite of what I just said. Convey respect, sometimes explicitly. I really respect how you manage our money. In this situation, I would like to discuss it. Criticize actions, not the other person's character. They can't change the gosh darn way they are. They can change some things. When requesting change, be clear about what you want the other to do. It's a lot easier if the person tells you what they want you to do next time. You don't have to, imagine what that might be. Stay on topic, don't kitchen sink. Don't bring in all the other complaints you've got. Be concise. Okay, so Riel actually has a way to do this. So I've got all these things to do, but if you read his book, he has a sequence for when it's really hairy between two people. You can try this formula. If those of you that may know about the XYZ formula, it's somewhat similar to that, but I like this better. And here's what you do. So you're upset about the other guy. You start out, you say what you saw or heard, like a video camera. So the video camera saw that I was waiting in the restaurant and you were 15 minutes late for our 6 o'clock dinner. That's what the videotape might have shown. What you made up about it. Use the words made up because it makes it obvious that it's individualized and construed by you, how you construed it. I felt when you were late, I thought it meant that you don't care about me and I'm less important to you than your work, for instance. Say how you then felt, the feelings. It made me angry and kind of hopeless about our relationship. So the feelings come after the construal. And then the last, what you want the person to do, again, what you want. Next time I'd appreciate it if you'd give me a call if you're running late. So that's the feedback formula. Again, it's deceptively simple. It would definitely help you. Okay, a couple more things and then we'll stop. Work on self-awareness. That was the whole first part of this talk. Ask what your hot buttons have been activated, what hot buttons have been activated, your CNI, is it in the room? Do the same for your partner. Take steps to remain calm. Okay, don't just press on. If you can't think, if you're starting to get so angry that you can't think, better do something about it. Self-soothe, take deep breaths. They're surprisingly helpful. You know that business about counting to 10. Actually, pro athletes know this. They've learned this. When people are terribly anxious, deep breathing really helps. It's like, anyway, we could talk about that. But whatever self-talk calms you down, like talk to yourself, this isn't the only thing that's going to happen to me today. My wife really loves me. Whatever you want to say that will calm you down a bit. If you really are at your limit, let your partner know, I'm really having trouble thinking. And consider calling a timeout. Now, if you want to call a timeout, that's okay, but the one rule is you have to say when you're coming back. My wife sometimes would call a timeout and go drive around the neighborhood, and then she'd come back. But she'd say, like, I'll be back. I'll be back, and when I get back, then we can talk more about it. Otherwise, the other person just feels you're running away and will chase you in their car. Okay, work harder at empathy. Unilaterally take the role of empathic listener. Cease attempting to problem solve, take up the role. Now this really works for me. My wife, this is one that is kind of funny. It's like she, teaching marriage education, I always, and as a psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, you always expect your spouse to come back at you with something like, you teach this stuff? I can't believe it. You suck, at this. So, but the honest truth is that Sheila actually doesn't say that, at least not in public. In public, what she says is, I got to admit, grudgingly, that Art actually is really good at this stuff. It's like we're in the middle of a fight, and all of a sudden he sort of switches pulls a switch or something, and I know it's different, and then somehow it goes differently, and then we do better. And this is what the switch is. The switch is learned from years of doing therapy with people, not just from my wife, is you unilaterally switch to the role of empathic listener. So try it, you'll like it. That's something to do. And in order to do that, you can recall situations you've experienced that are similar. Your partner might not be describing something you've ever done, but I'm sure you've done something similar, and that's how one way you can feel your way into being empathic. Remind yourself that in any heated argument, there's always truth on both sides. The last thing, speak up to bridge the gap. If you agree with certain disputed or painful facts, don't act functionally deaf. Most of my couples, what they do is they listen to stuff. The person says 3 or 4 things, they all agree with those things, and they say one thing wrong, and they say, hey, that's not right. So if you agree with the first 3 things, say, yes, I was late, or whatever. Yes, I did spill on you, whatever it was. Yes, I did go on too long with Cindy's homework. Okay, verbalize your understanding of what the other said and how you think they feel. It really upset you that I was late. Even if you don't agree with something, speak up, let the other person know you heard them. It's the thing that people really need is to be heard more than almost anything. Okay, so now if you succeed in all this, if you become a more mature person and you can manage conflict, and you can be loving like the brother in Lars, you may end up like this, where the correlation coefficient is very high, and you feel this tremendous emotional closeness and warmth and support from your partner. And these are the references, and that's it. Thank you. Give it up. Couple questions? So who's got a question? Yeah.
Is CNI always connected to family of origin?
No, I'm glad you said that. Ask that question. No, very often it can be earlier relationships. And so it could be the boyfriend from high school or the previous spouse that is the most traumatic situation. In other words, it's the thing though that most frightens you. But very often it could be it could be the frightening grandmother, it could be the older brother, it could be, so people can have that to other relationships, not just the family of origin. Good question.
But it is based in a relationship.
I'm trying to think of, I can't think of one where it isn't. I mean, these are where we learn from our experiences with other people. I don't even think you can do it vicariously. In other words, I don't think it really, even if your friend had a situation, it wouldn't necessarily be close enough. Maybe there could be a vicarious one, but other questions? That's a great question. Yeah.
I'm curious about your coursework and the training program, Train the Trainer, that John Bennett mentioned. And I wonder if the in that, or?
I don't have a train the trainer thing. I mean, I maybe don't have as much energy as John, and I'm hoping to write this up as a textbook, the class, which is a lot more classes and has ones on many other topics. It's like it's a 4-credit, it's a quarter-long class. But no, John and I both do speak at the Smart Marriages Conference, which is a wonderful place if you want to know more about relationships, and if they have people at all levels of expertise talking about intimate relationships and how to make them healthier. Other questions? This year it's in Orlando in July. Oop, I'm not seeing it. Speak up. Oh, yeah, sorry. Oh, John? Yeah.
Well, this is something you covered, but I've got an example just from my own marriage, and hopefully you're on.
Good.
I've been married 37 years,
Good.
and we're happily married. But we had some counseling once, and it has to do with managing conflict. Rather than get into the blame thing and making generalizations, you always, whatever. And you made this point too. You can always say how you feel.
Yes.
A person cannot argue with
Yes. How you feel, what you've made of it, and then what.
how something makes you feel.
Right.
They can't argue with that.
That's right.
And all of a sudden it starts bridging understanding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's tremendously important. Actually, it reminded me of another thing. The lecture that comes after the lecture on conflict, which is that we also believe that forgiveness and acceptance are tremendously important. So the idea of the conflict discussion is not simply to, reach a consensus or come up with a solution. Are we going to move to another city because somebody got a job there? I mean, there are real. Are we going to have another kid? There are real decisions that are significant other than just I'm mad at you because you didn't do the dishes right. But very often in happy marriages, it's learning to live with the differences and not continually fight about them. So there's a certain amount of acceptance. It's partly why compatibility is so important across a lot of dimensions, because if you're more compatible, you're less likely to have a lot of differences that are constantly agitating you over the years. So there's truth in just, often people will say, whatever the problems are at the beginning, you're marrying a set of problems. Those are the problems you're going to have, and hopefully they're not too serious. But what I've been talking about is how do you deal with the conflict when it comes up. But another way is to sort of see that, for instance, I give you an example. Okay, so I try to solve my problem of the incompetent mother that's going to get me lost. So what do I do the second time around? I marry the hyper-competent career woman who is terrifically responsible and is actually even more obsessive-compulsive than I am in some ways. We both loved each other instantly because we both had really neat apartments, okay? That's, for a lot of people, that's astonishing. But in any event, so I thought, okay, this is great. I'm never going to have to remind her of stuff, and it's great and all that. And it is. It's just that that she's also sometimes out ahead of me on stuff, like we'll decide that we need to get a new TV, and I'm thinking, well, I'd like to research it on, online and check it out and stuff like that. Sheila's already bought it, like the next day. She's so the opposite of my mom. So I think part of me is going, when you have that kind of experience, you go, oh, she did it again. She didn't consult me, and it's like, ooh, I wish she would have. And then I have to remind myself, well, that's the flip side. It's the same character trait that I admire so much of the time. She's such a self-starter. Isn't that wonderful? It's just so terrific, all the stuff she does without my having to check it out. So sometimes the same things that you admire will also be a source of problems, and then you have to take a kind of philosophical attitude towards that, I think. Something else? Anybody else want to get me going on some other? Yeah.
You said that dating shouldn't be that hard. I just wondered how you feel like that relates to dating culture now and cohabitation and everything. That there's more conflict possibly in dating relationships than there used to be.
what makes you think?
She's saying there's more conflict in dating relationships. Is there?
You're not sure. You're wondering.
Is there?
Based on what you were saying about like that dating should be the easy part, right? Because then the marriage decisions come in with children and all those sorts of things. But the way that culture like is changing and that there's cohabitation and then there are those financial bonds and other kinds of things.
Well,
okay, let me say this. I actually, one of my agendas coming here was I really don't know. I think one of the things John said was very interesting is this whole thing about, or actually it was before that, the lead-in to him was his whole talk is about sort of staging things in an expectable way, and he mentioned like the cultures that used to have at different stages. Even when I was at Harvard, we didn't have co-ed dorms, as I mentioned. We had like parietal hours. Like, I remember driving like mad back to Wellesley to get my girlfriend back before 11, or I'd get killed or something. I don't know what happened. If she didn't get back, she turned into a pumpkin. I don't know. But it was like, there were these structures, and before that, there were, like, if you go back in time, like men and women weren't allowed to be together. There were before the pill, there was like, more of a fear of pregnancy. Then and certainly you didn't have people cohabiting. I didn't know anybody. So everything has kind of gotten jumbled, and I love John's example of the second married, the people that could, because they have money and they're single and they've got a place to live, they can get together and have sex on the right away. I mean, in the past there were all sorts of impediments, and that made it sort of go in a expectable way, which I think in my generation was that there was a question earlier, mostly went, you tried to date people, this is a question you fielded around, should you date somebody that you're thinking of marrying? I think my answer to that question was sort of like yes and no also, but that when I was doing it, I was mainly shooting for that it would be somebody where I was thinking that maybe they were marriage material. Now I think because people have put off marriage till after graduate school and all, and they cohabit with, that's a whole nother topic. There is a lot of uncertainty about how the thing ought to go. Now, whether there's more inherent conflict about that, I'm not sure. What I know is there are, of course, then areas where you could have conflict, like should we move in together before we're married, which wouldn't have been a problem. What I was just trying to say is I do see occasionally couples will come to me for, quotes, premarital counseling, and they're already fighting like mad over these, what I think of as their core negative images are activated, not just in the car like with me and Sheila, but all the time. And this is under circumstances that I consider to be kind of optimal, like all they're doing is going out to dinner and a movie and having a nice talk, and they don't have to share finances, and there's a certain amount of sexual involvement. And I'd say if you're fighting and that's your relationship, there's something really incompatible there. That was my point. I don't know if I'm completely answering your question. I don't know the answers to some of the questions that I can imagine are out there. Anyway. Other question? One more question? Am I not? No? Thank you.